The alarm bells started ringing across the draconian capital at exactly midnight. Within minutes, every guard in the city was awake and moving. Emperor Vortex's 3 children were missing. Not just missing from their beds, but completely vanished from the most secure tower in the entire empire. The palace guards tore through the royal quarters, checking every room, every closet, every hidden passage that had been used by young royals for centuries. Nothing. The heirs had simply disappeared into thin air. Emperor Vortex stood on his throne room balcony, his massive wings spread wide as he watched his city turn upside down. Guard ships flew between buildings, scanning for any trace of his children. Ground troops knocked on doors and searched warehouses. The entire empire was about to learn that the royal heirs were gone, and someone would have to answer for it. His rage was so intense that the palace staff could feel the temperature rise in every room he entered. The strange thing was the silence. When royalty gets kidnapped, someone usually wants something. Money, power, political concessions. But no messages came through. No anonymous threats. No demands at all. The Imperial Communications Center stayed quiet, which made everything worse. The Emperor's advisors whispered among themselves, afraid to speak too loudly. If this was an assassination, why hadn't they found bodies? If it was a kidnapping, where was the ransom? The mystery gnawed at everyone. Meanwhile, across the city in the industrial district where few nobles ever visited, Tom Bradley wiped oil off his hands and squinted at the hoverbike engine in front of him. The thing had been making a weird noise for weeks, and the owner insisted it was nothing serious. Tom had found 3 cracked fuel lines and a damaged power coupling. People never wanted to believe that weird noises meant expensive repairs. Tom had been on the draconian homeworld for about 5 years now. He'd come out here looking for work after things hadn't worked out back on Earth. Turns out, being a mechanic was valuable anywhere in the galaxy. Machines broke down the same way whether they were human-made or alien-made. You just had to understand the principles. The Draconians built good equipment, but they had a habit of over-engineering things. Too many redundant systems, too much automation. When something broke, their repair manuals were thick enough to stop bullets. He preferred the hands-on approach. Take it apart, find the problem, fix the problem, put it back together. Simple. His shop sat between a warehouse and a shipping depot. The Draconians who lived in this part of town were working class, just trying to get by. They treated Tom well enough, though he knew most of them saw humans as kind of cute in a simple way. Like they appreciated that humans tried hard even if they weren't as naturally smart or strong as Draconians. Tom didn't mind. He let his work speak for itself. That third morning after the heirs vanished, Tom was replacing a motivator coil when his shop door chimed. He glanced up and saw the 3 kids who'd been hanging around for the past few days. They looked excited about something, chattering in their own language. The little one was already reaching for his welding goggles. Tom smiled. He still wasn't entirely sure where these kids came from. They'd wandered in 3 days ago, fascinated by everything in his workshop. Their scales were incredibly detailed, better than any costume he'd seen. Some kind of rich family thing, he figured. Maybe their parents worked at one of the fancy companies uptown and had money for expensive outfits. The kids had been surprisingly interested in what he did. Most children got bored after 5 minutes of watching someone work on machinery. These 3 asked questions constantly. How does this work? Why did you do it that way? What happens if you connect this to that? Tom had started showing them basic stuff. How to use a scanner to find electrical problems. How to test connections safely. The proper way to hold tools so you didn't hurt yourself. They'd come back yesterday earlier than before. And today they'd shown up right when he opened. The oldest one, the boy with the golden scales, seemed to understand mechanical principles faster than some adults Tom had trained. Tom was demonstrating how to rebuild a plasma coil, letting the kids take turns with the tools, when his shop door exploded inward. Armed guards in Imperial armor stormed inside, weapons raised, shouting commands in the Draconian military dialect. Tom's hands shot up automatically. His heart hammered in his chest. At least 20 soldiers filled his small workshop, their weapons tracking between him and the children. Then they stopped. Every single guard froze mid-shout. Tom followed their stares. The 3 children sat calmly on his workshop floor, tools in their hands, looking confused about the interruption. The little girl still wore his welding goggles, pushed up on her forehead. The middle boy held a sonic wrench like it was treasure. The oldest boy had grease smeared across his golden scales and an unfinished plasma coil in his lap. The lead guard's weapon lowered slowly. His voice came out as barely a whisper. Your Imperial Highnesses. Tom's stomach dropped. Imperial? His legs felt weak. Oh no. Oh no no no. These weren't kids in costumes. These were the Emperor's actual children. The ones the entire city had been searching for. The ones whose disappearance had triggered the biggest manhunt in planetary history. And they were sitting on his floor, covered in grease, playing with his tools. The youngest girl, Lyra, looked up at the guards and said something in their language. Her tone was annoyed, like they'd interrupted something important. The oldest boy, Drake, carefully set down the plasma coil and stood up, his posture suddenly regal despite the grease stains. Tom's mind raced. He was going to be executed. There was no other outcome. The Emperor's children had been missing for 3 days, and they'd been found in his shop. He tried to explain, words tumbling out. I didn't know who they were. They just came in. I thought they were local kids. I was just teaching them about machines. I swear I didn't kidnap anybody. The guards weren't listening. They were already surrounding him, weapons ready. Heavy metal cuffs locked around his wrists. Someone was talking into a communicator, probably telling the Emperor they'd found the human responsible. As they dragged him toward the door, Tom looked back. The 3 royal children were protesting loudly, their voices rising in anger. But it didn't matter. He was a human mechanic who'd somehow ended up with the Emperor's missing heirs. And that meant his life was probably over. The transport to the palace felt like the longest ride of Tom's life. The guards hadn't said a word to him. They just kept their weapons pointed in his direction while the vehicle flew over the city. Tom could see crowds gathered below, looking up. News of the heirs being found must have spread fast. He wondered if everyone down there thought he was some kind of monster who'd stolen children. His wrists hurt where the metal cuffs dug into his skin. He tried explaining things to the guards during the ride, but they acted like he wasn't even there. One of them had actually turned up his helmet's audio filters, making it clear they didn't want to hear anything a human had to say. When they landed at the palace, guards yanked him out of the transport so hard he stumbled. The palace was enormous, all white stone and gold decorations that probably cost more than Tom would make in 10 lifetimes. They marched him through hallways wide enough to fly a ship through, past paintings of ancient draconian warriors and battles. Every servant and noble they passed stopped to stare. A human in chains being dragged through the imperial palace. Tom had never felt smaller in his entire life. The throne room doors were massive, at least 50 feet tall, carved with scenes of dragons conquering worlds. The guards pushed them open and shoved Tom inside. The room was so big his workshop could have fit inside it 20 times over. Hundreds of draconian nobles lined the walls, all dressed in fancy robes and jewelry. Their eyes followed him as the guards forced him to walk down the center aisle. At the far end, Emperor Vortex sat on a throne that looked like it was carved from a single piece of black crystal. The Emperor was huge, easily 3 times Tom's height, with dark red scales that seemed to absorb light. His wings were folded behind him, but Tom could see they'd span the width of the room if opened. The Emperor's eyes glowed with barely contained fury. Tom had seen angry people before. This was different. This was the rage of someone who could level cities if he wanted. Tom's legs felt like they might give out. He'd heard stories about the Emperor. How he'd personally fought in wars, how his fire breath could melt starship hulls. And now that Emperor was staring at Tom like he was deciding which way to kill him. The shouting started before the guards even stopped walking. Tom heard young voices screaming in protest. He looked to the side and saw the 3 royal children being held back by attendants. Lyra was actually trying to bite one of them. Rex was yelling something over and over. Drake, the oldest, was using what sounded like very formal language, but his voice was angry. They were trying to defend him. The attendants pulled them toward a side door despite their protests. Drake locked eyes with Tom for just a second, and there was something in that look. An apology maybe. Or a promise. Then they were gone, and Tom was alone facing the Emperor. "Kneel," one of the guards hissed, kicking the back of Tom's knee. He dropped hard onto the polished floor. It hurt, but he barely noticed. He was too busy trying not to pass out from fear. Emperor Vortex leaned forward on his throne. When he spoke, his voice made the whole room vibrate. "You will explain how you managed to abduct my children from the most secure location in the Empire. You will explain who you work for. You will explain everything, or you will die screaming." Tom's mouth was so dry he could barely speak. "Your Majesty, I didn't abduct anyone. I swear. I didn't even know who they were." "Lies," someone shouted from the crowd. Other voices joined in. The nobles wanted blood. His blood. "Silence," the Emperor commanded, and the room went instantly quiet. He gestured to someone Tom couldn't see. "Bring the scanners. We will know the truth." 2 technicians approached with a machine on a floating cart. They positioned it next to Tom and attached sensors to his head. The cold metal pressed against his temples. Tom had heard about truth scanners. They were supposed to be impossible to fool, reading brain patterns and stress responses to detect lies. If it worked like people said, at least they'd know he was telling the truth. If it worked, if they believed it. A hum filled the air as the machine powered up. One of the technicians nodded to the Emperor. "Scanners active, Your Majesty. He cannot lie without us knowing." "Speak," Emperor Vortex commanded. Tom took a shaky breath and started from the beginning. How 3 days ago these kids had walked into his shop. How they'd seemed fascinated by everything, asking question after question about how machines worked. How their scales and wings looked so real he'd figured it was some kind of expensive costume, like something rich parents might buy for their children. How he'd thought they were just local kids from the nicer part of town. "I showed them basic stuff," Tom continued. "How to use a scanner safely. How to identify what's broken in a circuit. They kept coming back earlier each time. By yesterday they showed up right when I opened the shop. They seemed really interested in learning, so I kept teaching them. I thought maybe they didn't get much attention at home or something. I was just trying to be nice." The Grand Chancellor, an old draconian with silver scales, stepped forward. "This is absurd. Royal heirs would never voluntarily spend time with a common laborer. He must have used some form of mind control. Perhaps a chemical agent or forbidden technology. The scanners would detect that," one of the technicians said quietly. "Then scan his shop," the Chancellor insisted. "Search every inch of it. There must be something." Tom watched as the Emperor gestured to more guards, sending them to search his workshop. His heart sank. They were going to tear apart everything he owned, and they still wouldn't believe him. Because the truth was too simple. Too ridiculous. Why would royal children, heirs to an entire empire, want to hang out in a greasy repair shop with a human mechanic? The scanners continued humming, monitoring his every word. The technicians studied their displays, occasionally looking up at Tom with confused expressions. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the lead technician spoke. "Your Majesty, the human is telling the truth. No deception detected. No signs of chemical influence or mind-affecting technology in his system. His story is genuine." The Grand Chancellor looked like he'd been slapped. "That's impossible." "Yet it is what the scanners show," the technician replied. Emperor Vortex stood from his throne, and Tom actually flinched. The Emperor descended the steps slowly, each footstep echoing through the silent room. He stopped directly in front of Tom, close enough that Tom could feel heat radiating from his scales. "Look at me, human," the Emperor said quietly. Somehow that was more terrifying than the shouting. Tom forced himself to look up, meeting those glowing eyes. "What did you do to bewitch my children?" The Emperor's voice was soft now, almost confused. "What power do you possess?" Tom almost laughed. It would have been hysterical, but he was too scared. "I don't have any power, Your Majesty. I just answered their questions. Kids are curious. They wanted to learn something real. I just treated them like people, not like..." He caught himself, realizing what he was about to say. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "Not like what?" Tom swallowed hard. There was no point lying now. The scanners would catch it anyway. "Not like royalty, sir. I just treated them like regular kids who wanted to learn." The throne room went dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Tom was sure he'd just said the thing that would get him executed. But Emperor Vortex just stared at him, those burning eyes searching Tom's face for something. Finally the Emperor spoke one word. "Interesting." The Emperor had Tom released from the chains, but he wasn't free to leave. Guards escorted him to a guest room in the palace's east wing. It was nicer than anywhere Tom had ever stayed. The bed was bigger than his entire apartment back on Earth. But the door was locked from the outside and guards stood in the hallway. He was a prisoner, just a comfortable one. Tom figured they'd keep him locked up while they decided what to do with him. Maybe they'd eventually deport him back to Earth. Maybe something worse. He tried not to think about it. But the next morning he heard shouting in the hallway. Young voices arguing with guards. Then his door burst open and 3 royal heirs rushed inside, talking over each other in excitement. They'd found him. The guards looked uncomfortable but didn't stop them. Apparently, nobody wanted to be the one who told the Emperor's children they couldn't see the human. Lyra grabbed Tom's hand and started pulling him toward the door. Rex was already explaining something about the palace workshops. Drake, more formal but just as eager, said the workshops had equipment Tom needed to see. Within minutes, Tom found himself being dragged through the palace by 3 excited kids while confused guards followed at a distance. High above in the palace security center, Emperor Vortex watched it all unfold on video feeds. He'd ordered his security team to track the humans' every move. He needed to understand what made this creature special. What power did he have over the imperial heirs? The emperor watched as his children pulled Tom into the palace workshops. These were the finest facilities in the empire, filled with equipment worth more than most planets. The royal tutors used them for demonstrations, showing the heirs how various technologies worked. The children had always seemed bored during those lessons. But now, watching the feeds, the emperor saw something different. His children were energized, alive. They surrounded Tom, asking questions, pointing at different machines. Tom looked overwhelmed by the expensive equipment around him, but he was smiling. The emperor leaned closer to the screen. What was the human doing? Tom had found an old malfunctioning servo motor on a workbench. Something the tutors had probably been using as a teaching example. He held it up, turning it in his hands, and asked the children a question. Not explaining. Asking. The heirs gathered around, examining it. Drake pointed at something. Tom nodded and handed him a diagnostic scanner. This was wrong, the emperor thought. Teachers were supposed to teach. They were supposed to explain things, share their knowledge, demonstrate their expertise. But this human was making his children do the work. Except they were doing it. Drake ran the scanner carefully, studying the readings. Lyra leaned in to see. Rex grabbed a notebook and started writing something down. They were focused in a way the emperor had never seen during their formal lessons. Your Majesty, one of the security officers said. Should we intervene? The human is allowing the heirs to handle potentially dangerous equipment. No, the emperor said slowly. Let them continue. But keep weapons trained on the human at all times. Over the next hour, Emperor Vortex watched something that made no sense. Tom barely touched anything himself. He asked questions. He guided. When Lyra wanted to open the motor casing, Tom showed her which tools to use and then stepped back, letting her do it. When she chose the wrong tool, he didn't correct her. He let her try, let her realize it wouldn't work, and then asked her why she thought it hadn't worked. This was the opposite of everything the emperor knew about education. The royal tutors were the finest minds in the empire. They'd been selected for their knowledge, their expertise, their ability to transfer information efficiently. They gave structured lessons with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Tom's method looked like chaos. But the children were learning. The emperor could see it. When Lyra finally got the motor casing open using the correct tool, her face lit up with genuine pride. Not because someone had praised her, but because she'd figured it out herself. Then came the incident that made the emperor sit up straight in his chair. Lyra had been examining the servo motor's control panel, tracing wire connections like Tom had shown her. She touched two contacts at the same time and sparks flew. The panel short-circuited with a bang that made everyone jump. Lyra yelped and stumbled backward, startled but unhurt. The emperor's hand moved toward the alarm that would send guards rushing in. His daughter had been hurt. The human would pay. But Lyra wasn't crying. She was staring at the smoking panel with wide eyes, surprised but curious. And Tom wasn't panicking. He calmly knelt next to her and asked if she was okay. She nodded. Then, instead of scolding her or taking over, Tom asked her what she thought had happened. The emperor watched, amazed, as his youngest daughter worked through the problem out loud. She'd connected positive and negative, created a short circuit, bypassed the safety systems. Tom nodded along, asking gentle questions that guided her thinking. Then he asked her how she could fix it. Not how he would fix it, how she could fix it. Together they traced the damage. Tom showed her how to test each connection, how to identify what was burned out, how to safely replace the damaged components. He let her do most of the work, only stepping in when she was truly stuck. When they finished and the panel powered back on successfully, Lyra looked more proud than the emperor had ever seen her. Later, when Rex got frustrated trying to calibrate a sensor array, Tom didn't tell him the answer. Instead, he sat down and told a story about his first job as an apprentice back on Earth. How he'd been working on a transport engine and had installed a regulator backwards. The engine had exploded, covering him in coolant and oil. His boss had been furious. He'd felt like a complete failure. But that's how I learned, Tom said. I never installed a regulator wrong again. Your brain remembers mistakes better than it remembers being told the right answer. Rex thought about that, then turned back to his sensor array with new determination. The emperor watched for hours. He saw patterns emerge. The palace tutors taught his children what to think. This human taught them how to think. The tutors filled their heads with information. Tom taught them to solve problems, to learn from failure, to figure things out themselves. It was messy, inefficient. The children made mistakes constantly. But they were engaged in a way they never were during formal lessons. And they were retaining the information. The Emperor could tell because they started applying things Tom had taught them to new problems without being prompted. In the evening, after the children had finally been collected by their attendants for dinner, Emperor Vortex sat in his private office reviewing the day's footage. This human had no special technology, no mind control, no powers at all. He just had a different way of teaching. A human way, apparently. But down in the Grand Chancellor's quarters, a very different conversation was happening. The Chancellor sat with several high-ranking nobles, their faces serious in the dim light. "This cannot continue," the Chancellor said. "The human is making them soft, teaching them to value manual labor, to get their hands dirty like common workers. He's destroying everything we've tried to build in them." "The Emperor seems fascinated by it," one noble pointed out carefully. "The Emperor is being fooled," the Chancellor snapped. "Royal heirs should not be learning to fix broken machines. They should be learning to rule, to command, to maintain the dignity of their station. This human influence will weaken them, make them sympathetic to the lower classes. It threatens the entire social structure." The nobles exchanged looks. What the Chancellor was suggesting was dangerous. But he had a point. If the future rulers of the empire learned to value workers and craftsmen, learned to see them as equals instead of subjects, what would that mean for the established order? "What do you propose?" another noble asked quietly. The Grand Chancellor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I propose we demonstrate exactly why humans should not be trusted. Why their methods are dangerous. We need an incident. Something that shows the Emperor that this human's influence puts the heirs at risk." In the shadows of the palace, plans began to form. Plans that would put everything at risk. The Festival of Stars was the biggest celebration in the Draconian Empire. It happened once every 5 years, and this year the capital city was packed with millions of visitors from across the galaxy. The streets glowed with decorations. Vendors sold food from 100 different worlds. Musicians played on every corner. And high above it all, the imperial family's ceremonial flagship waited to begin the light show that would kick off 3 days of celebration. Tom stood on a palace balcony watching the crowds below. He'd been in the palace for 2 weeks now, and the Emperor had given him surprising freedom. The heirs visited him daily in the workshops. The guards had stopped pointing weapons at him. He still wasn't sure if he was a guest or a prisoner, but at least nobody was talking about executing him anymore. The flagship was beautiful, hanging in the sky like a massive jewel. It was ancient, built centuries ago, used only for ceremonies. Tom had heard the heirs talking about it excitedly. They'd be aboard with their parents for the lighting ceremony, and they couldn't wait. At exactly sunset, the imperial family boarded the flagship. Tom watched through the balcony's viewing screen as they waved to the crowds. Emperor Vortex, the Empress, and the 3 heirs all dressed in formal ceremonial robes. Lyra looked tiny next to her parents. Drake stood straight and proud, every bit the crown prince. Rex kept fidgeting with his collar. The ship began its ceremonial flight path over the city. Lights on its hull started cycling through colors and the crowd below cheered. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. In just a few minutes, the ship would activate its core display, creating a light show visible from orbit. Then Tom's communicator buzzed. It was Drake's personal channel, the one the prince had given him for their workshop sessions. Tom answered it expecting to hear excited chatter about the view from the ship. Instead he heard panic. "Tom, something's wrong. The ship's systems are failing." Drake's voice was high with fear, the formal prince mask completely gone. Tom's blood went cold. "What do you mean failing?" "Everything. Power fluctuations, containment warnings, the core temperature is rising. The engineers are yelling at each other. Nobody knows what to do." Tom could hear alarms blaring in the background, adult voices shouting orders. He pulled up the palace's external monitors, accessing the public feed of the flagship. To the crowds below, everything still looked normal. But Tom had spent his whole life around machines. He could see the irregular flicker in the power flow. The slight wobble in the ship's flight path. Something was very wrong. "Put me through to your chief engineer," Tom said, his mind already racing. "They won't listen to a human." Drake protested. "Try anyway." A moment later, a draconian voice came through, stressed and angry. "Who is this?" "Tom Bradley, I'm a mechanic. What's your situation?" "The core containment is collapsing. Someone sabotaged the primary regulators. We're venting plasma into the secondary systems. I've got maybe 10 minutes before the whole thing goes critical. Can you evacuate? We're over the festival crowds. If we evacuate and the ship crashes, it'll kill thousands." If we try to fly it away from the city, we won't make it. The core will breach. Tom's mind worked frantically. A ship that old, with sabotage systems. The Draconian engineers would try to fix it the proper way, following protocols and procedures. But there wasn't time for proper. They needed fast and dirty. What about a manual bypass of the containment field? Tom asked. The access panels are in sections too small for adults. We'd need to send technicians, but there's no time to get them here. Tom felt something click in his mind. Too small for adults. But not too small for children. Drake, are you still there? Tom asked. I'm here. The prince's voice was steadier now, like having something to focus on helped. Listen to me very carefully. Remember everything I taught you about power systems. About thinking creatively when the normal solution doesn't work. I need you, Lyra and Rex, to trust me completely. Can you do that? Yes. No hesitation. Tom started talking fast, pulling up ship schematics on his communicator. The palace systems had technical manuals for everything, including the ceremonial flagship. He studied the layout, finding the maintenance shafts, the backup systems, the waste power could be rerouted if you were willing to ignore safety protocols. The core is overheating because the primary containment regulators are fried, Tom explained. The engineers are trying to repair them, but that takes too long. You need to bypass them completely and route containment power through the backup environmental systems. That's not how it's designed to work, Drake said. I know, but it'll work anyway. Remember what I taught you. Systems don't care about design intentions. They care about what actually happens when you connect them. Tom walked Drake through it step by step. The prince would need to access a maintenance shaft behind the crew quarters. Lyra would have to crawl through to reach the environmental power junction. Rex would need to reroute control signals through the navigation backup systems. It was insane. No trained engineer would ever do it this way. But trained engineers were too big to reach these spaces, and there wasn't time for proper solutions. The engineers are saying it won't work, Drake reported. They're right. It shouldn't work. But it will. Trust me. Tom heard the prince talking to his siblings. Then he heard the sound of a maintenance panel being opened. Drake was doing it. The heirs were actually going into the maintenance shafts while the ship's core was melting down. Lyra, you're going to see a lot of wires, Tom said, forcing his voice to stay calm. I need you to find the blue conduits. They'll be bundled together about this thick. He held up his fingers, then realized she couldn't see him. About as thick as your wrist. I see them. Lyra's small voice came through. Good. Now you're going to disconnect them from their current junction and reconnect them to the red conduits 2 panels down. But you have to do it in the right order or you'll electrocute yourself. He talked her through it step by careful step. Meanwhile, Drake was accessing control panels, overriding safety systems that were designed to prevent exactly what they were doing. Rex squeezed through a crawlspace that made Tom nervous just hearing about it, reaching navigation controls that were never meant to handle power loads this high. It was messy. It was dangerous. It violated every engineering principle the Draconians had. But it was working. Core temperature dropping. The chief engineer's voice came through, sounding shocked. Containment field stabilizing. How is this possible? Tom let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Rex, I need you to lock in those settings. Make sure the system can't automatically revert. On it, Rex replied, his voice tight with concentration. Minutes passed like hours. Tom talked them through the final connections, the safety checks, the confirmation procedures. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His hands shook. But his voice stayed steady. The kids needed him steady. It's working, Drake finally said. All systems showing stable. Core temperature normal. Below, the crowds had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. The flagship completed its ceremonial flight, the light show activated perfectly, and millions of people cheered. The imperial family waved from the observation deck like nothing had happened. But up in the palace, Tom sat down hard on the balcony floor, his legs giving out. 3 kids had just saved thousands of lives using methods no engineer would approve of. Methods he'd taught them. And somewhere in the palace, the Grand Chancellor's plan had just fallen apart in the worst possible way. The investigation into the sabotage took less than 24 hours. Once the engineers examined the flagship's systems, they found evidence everywhere. The regulators hadn't failed naturally. Someone had deliberately damaged them, timing it to fail during the ceremony. Security pulled records, tracked access logs, and followed the trail of evidence straight to the Grand Chancellor's network of allies. By morning, the Chancellor and 6 high-ranking nobles were in chains. The conspiracy had involved more people than anyone expected, all of them terrified of what Tom's influence might mean for the Empire's social order. They'd been willing to risk thousands of lives to prove that human methods were dangerous. Instead, they'd proven the opposite. But the conspiracy wasn't what had the Imperial Court buzzing. It was how the crisis had been solved. 3 children, using techniques no formal engineer would ever consider, had saved the flagship. They'd crawled through spaces adults couldn't reach, connected systems that weren't meant to be connected, and ignored every safety protocol in the book. And it had worked. The court engineers were deeply uncomfortable with this. They'd spent decades learning the proper ways to do things. They'd memorized technical manuals, passed rigorous examinations, earned prestigious certifications. And 3 kids with a few weeks of informal training from a human mechanic had solved a problem that would have stumped most professionals. Some engineers argued it was just luck. Others insisted the solution was too dangerous to be considered valid. But nobody could argue with results. The ship was fine. Everyone survived. And the heirs had proven they could think on their feet in ways their expensive education had never taught them. Emperor Vortex summoned Tom to his private office 3 days after the festival. Not the throne room with its crowds of nobles. Just a quiet office with a desk and comfortable chairs. The Emperor looked tired. He gestured for Tom to sit, which was shocking enough. Humans didn't sit in the Emperor's presence. But Tom was learning that this Emperor didn't always follow the rules either. "I've been watching the recordings of what happened on the flagship," the Emperor said. "My engineers tell me what my children did should not have worked. That it was reckless and violated fundamental principles of safe engineering." Tom's stomach tightened. Here it came. He'd put the royal heirs in danger. They'd succeed, but that might not matter. But the Emperor continued. Yet it did work. More than that, it was the only solution that could have worked in the time available. My chief engineer admitted that his team would have failed. The ship would have exploded. But 3 children trained by a human mechanic succeeded where experts would have died trying. The Emperor stood and walked to his window, looking out over the city. "I need to understand something. I've given my children the finest education in the Empire. The best tutors, the most advanced facilities, access to knowledge that most citizens will never see. But in the moment they needed it most, none of that helped them. What you taught them in a few weeks did." "Why?" Tom thought about how to explain it. "Your Majesty, with respect, I think you've been training your kids to be rulers. You know, people who give orders, who understand theory, who can talk about how things should work in perfect conditions. And what did you train them to be? People who can fix things when they break." Tom leaned forward. "Look, I'm not smart like your tutors. I never went to fancy schools. But I've spent my whole life making broken things work again. And the thing about the real world is that nothing ever breaks the way the manual says it should. You can't just follow the instructions. You have to understand the principles, then figure out how to apply them to the weird situation in front of you." The Emperor turned back to face him. "Go on." "Humans never had the luxury of being too important to get our hands dirty," Tom said. "We spent thousands of years as the underdogs in our own world. We weren't the strongest or the fastest. We couldn't fly or breathe underwater. All we had was our ability to solve problems, to adapt, to try things that shouldn't work and make them work anyway. We learned that the universe doesn't care about your status or your credentials. It only cares whether you can actually solve the problem in front of you." The Emperor sat down again, studying Tom's face. "You're saying I've been teaching my children to think they're above problems. And you taught them to solve problems." "Your kids are great," Tom said. "They're smart, curious, brave. They didn't need someone telling them how special they were. They already knew that from everyone around them. What they needed was someone showing them they were capable. That they could take things apart and put them back together. That making mistakes was okay as long as they learned from them. That being royal didn't mean being perfect. It meant being responsible for finding solutions." Silence filled the office. Tom wondered if he'd gone too far. You probably weren't supposed to tell an emperor he'd been raising his kids wrong. Finally, Emperor Vortex spoke. "I want you to stay. As the royal tutor. Full position, formal title, whatever compensation you require." Tom shook his head. "With respect, Your Majesty, I'd be terrible at that. I'm not a teacher. I'm a mechanic who likes explaining things to curious kids." "Then what do you want?" Tom had been thinking about this for days. "A cultural exchange. Bring human engineers, mechanics and technicians to the Empire. Not as workers or servants. As colleagues. Let them work alongside your people, share methods, learn from each other. Humans have spent centuries figuring out how to solve problems with limited resources. Your people have technology and knowledge we can barely imagine. Put them together and see what happens." The Emperor considered this. You're asking me to validate humans as equals. To acknowledge that your species has value beyond manual labor. I'm asking you to let your people learn what my people are good at. Same way I've been learning from your technology. Nobody's better than anyone else. We're just different. And different can be useful. The Emperor stood and extended his hand in the human gesture Tom had taught the heirs. Agreed. I'll establish the exchange program. But I want you to run it. Tom shook the Emperor's hand, his human hand disappearing in the Emperor's massive scaled grip. Deal. Word of the exchange program spread through the Empire faster than official announcements could travel. The story got told and retold. 3 royal heirs and a human mechanic saving thousands of lives. Humans teaching Draconians to think differently. A minor species proving they had something valuable to offer. Human engineers started arriving within weeks. They worked in factories, shipyards, and research facilities. At first, the Draconian workers were skeptical. But they quickly learned that humans approached problems from angles Draconians never considered. They improvised, adapted, and found solutions using whatever was available. The cultural shift was slow but real. Draconians started seeing humans not as cute but limited creatures, but as creative problem solvers with unique perspectives. The social hierarchy didn't vanish overnight, but cracks appeared. If a human could teach the royal heirs, if human methods could save lives, maybe humans deserved more respect than they'd been given. Tom's workshop became a permanent fixture in the palace. The heirs still visited daily, now joined by other young Draconians whose parents wanted them to learn practical skills. Tom trained human assistants to help him, and together they taught a generation of students that knowledge meant nothing if you couldn't apply it. Lyra became an engineer, designing ships that incorporated both Draconian precision and human adaptability. Rex went into crisis management, leading teams that specialized in unconventional solutions. Drake, the Crown Prince, made it clear that when he became Emperor, the Empire would value capability over status. And sometimes, late at night, Tom would sit in his workshop and think about how strange life had turned out. He'd come to an alien world just looking for work. He'd fixed machines and answered questions from curious kids. And somehow, accidentally, he'd changed the relationship between 2 species. Not through wars or politics or grand speeches. Just by treating 3 children like they were capable of learning. Like they mattered beyond their titles. Like being royal meant responsibility, not superiority. Humanity's place in the galaxy had shifted. Not because humans were stronger or smarter, but because they'd proven they had something to teach. And sometimes, the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. In the end, that was the most human thing of all.